You spend enough time in Davos, you start to see patterns. The same CEOs making the same promises about sustainability and social impact. The same consultants going ahead and packaging those into beautiful little PowerPoint presentations. The same board members nodding along until it threatens their quarterly earnings. Then everyone quietly moves on. So my guest today, Shameek Bose, has spent 10 years in Davos, brokering multi-million-dollar partnership deals before moving on to Accenture and FleishmanHillard, where he advised Fortune 500 CEOs on sustainability, ESG, and responsible AI.
The companies that I work with that really understand that innovative framework and how renewables can lower prices of energy, how making long-term systemic investments will allow them to accelerate against their competitors. And in fact, you see this on a macro level in China. When the US has pulled back from renewable energy, China now is the world's leader in that. And as a result, their energy costs have come down.
He also serves on GLAAD's national board, came off of working on Zohran Mamdani's historic New York mayoral campaign.
It was just so refreshing to see somebody so young, dedicated, and committed to this way of life.
Shameek has watched corporations swing from sustainability is our future, we're pausing ESG initiatives faster than you can say quarterly earnings. And he's firsthand what's happened in politics and how it can change so suddenly that no one wants to be associated with the things they were championing 6 months ago. This is Confluently. We talk about money, power, and influence without the bullshit. So let's go ahead and get into it. Shameek, welcome to Confluently.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
It's really great to have you. So both of us have spent a significant portion of our current lives working at the World Economic Forum and going to Davos and all of those side events. And I think we both learned kind of some of the same lessons, which is what happens at Davos and what happens in the real world happen to usually be two different things. So let's start there. How and what did your time at WEF teach you about corporations' actions when they make decisions versus what they say they're going to make as decisions?
Well, that's a really important question today, especially as we see the current landscape in the US. To your earlier point, there were a lot of corporate promises made over the last several decades. And by far, I think they were made from really good intentions. I think there were a lot of stakeholders that they were responsible for, governments that were setting regulatory and policy guidelines, the EU especially, who was really advanced in that field. And then the other stakeholders were the employees who were holding them to the fire, right? And we were coming to a lot of consensus, and the WEF actually played a really major role in getting us to that consensus. And we were on this trajectory, and investments were being made in renewables and thinking about how we're going to make this acceleration towards AI without leaving people behind. Unfortunately, as you've noticed, we're in a very different world. And it seems like it happened overnight. And a lot of us are trying to figure out, well, how do we move forward now together in a way that is not so disruptive? And you see the disruption happening all over us. You see it in society, you see it in our communities, and you see it in the workplace as well, with turnovers and layoffs and mergers and acquisitions. And all of this is quite jolting for many individuals. And I think that, sometimes things need to get worse before it gets better. So the pendulum has swung, let's say, completely towards the other way. Now, the question is, and hopefully that's what we'll get to discuss together, is how do we bring it back to equilibrium?
I think that is going to be the hardest move that we do going forward. And, I remember being in a lot of those partnership meetings where everyone would talk about shared value creation, right? And stakeholder capitalism and all of these beautiful concepts. And the actual negotiation really ended up being a lot, especially in today's society, about logo placement and speaking slots. It really was transactional hell. And I think that's really kind of where we find ourselves today. But it was wrapped in the language of global impact. Now, you've obviously brokered several of these partnerships and you've moved them forward throughout your time at all of the various different corporations to go ahead and move this ball forward, right? What actual mechanism gets a CEO to write that check and to actually commit to it? because it's never really just about making the world better. It's also about making their underlying, performance better. So tell me about that.
Yeah, I would say it would be more fair to segment the companies into a couple of different buckets. There's absolutely one bucket of companies and CEOs that are extremely performative.
Yeah.
And I think they don't really have a long tenure in the sense or in the eyes of their constituents and their stakeholders. It's kind of easy in this social media age, in this data driven age, to figure out where your commitments are and how it shows up in your quarterly earnings and how it shows up in your supply chain. It's pretty traceable these days. Then there's a second bucket that goes along to get along. And what I mean by that is like there's a regulation they want to comply with. There is, they want to do it because all of their peers in the industry are doing so. And then there's a third bucket. This is the bucket that I love to work with. These are the Salesforces of the world and the Mark Benioffs of the world, Hamdi Ulukaya of Chobani of the world, who actually are extremely passionate about and dedicated to whether it's a social cause, an environmental cause that they really want to stand behind, and they're thinking generationally about the legacy that they want to leave behind. And so let's start there. I think there's those three buckets. The But to answer your question very directly, if you are not a leader that falls in that bucket that really cares about the secondary and tertiary impact of your dollar on community, on the environment, then you need a mechanism that ensures that you do. And my experience is that is at the board level.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of challenges at the board level, most of which, the most blatant of which, is that oftentimes the executives get to pick who's going to be on the board. And so they put favorable people there, but there are non-executive directors who are actually independent. I mean, that is
Mhm.
how it's supposed to be designed. But you see in some of these very notorious headlines from some of the richest people in the world that they're, unlimited compensation or uh, things that their powers goes unchecked. And so, but the board should be a mechanism that should provide the right checks and balances for institutions. And I'm still hopeful that we can come back to that semblance and have more legislative pressure or policy pressure or social norms that ensure that boards actually hold up criteria in a way that thinks through stakeholder theory and thinks through how their decisions are not just going to impact shareholder returns, but stakeholder returns as well.
I absolutely agree. Both you and I serve on many boards, and what is it? You can see the power struggles and the diversity of thought, which I think is so critical and important around that concept of who's on boards and the access and their positioning. For yourself, right? You're a person of color like me who has navigated Swiss elites and, Fortune 500 boardrooms. How much of that job was actually around code switching versus strategy? Because I've known from my own experience that part of the job is not just knowing how to move in those rooms, but who you need to be.
That's such an interesting question. I wouldn't say that I personally have to code switch at the board level because by the time you get to a board, the vetting process, and they really want you there because of who you are, who you represent, what value you can bring to the table. But along the way, you may have to do a little bit of code switching to get there. I think company cultures can be wildly different, and especially for more junior employees. I remember 25 years ago when I started working at banking. I worked on the ADR trading floor for 6 months at JPMorgan. It was a very challenging environment for me. I think the banking sector has significantly changed over the last 2 decades, but that is absolutely a place I can markedly say that I had to code switch in order to fit in. Once I even thought about wearing a wedding ring just so I can pretend to be, someone who's heteronormative, I guess. But I do think then I was fortunate enough to pivot my career in a way and in a space in which diversity and your differences actually created innovation, created value, brought impact to the lens. And so I didn't have to code switch as much. But there's a lot of people who do, right? And I think that's a personal choice, it's a personal sacrifice. And hopefully over time, with age, I think that's the other component here that one must remember is that we fall more into ourselves as we grow up, and we become more secure, more confident, and are able to show up as we are, and people respect that. And I think that takes a little bit of time and maturity to come.
I absolutely agree with that. I actually asked that question, with Madani's win and the way that society is going, that I feel it's something that, especially for young people that are coming up through, corporate America and coming up through politics and coming up through these various different spaces, that we don't talk enough about the performance that is required sometimes of us to go ahead and belong in those spaces, while also being the person in the room who's supposed to represent diversity and different perspectives. It's really kind of exhausting from time to time. But switching gears a little bit. So you've moved from WEF and Davos to Accenture, really to go ahead and continue this effectiveness within board effectiveness and sustainability practices, right? So what's the difference between boards that say they care about it versus actually the ones that this excites them and gets them out of bed in the morning?
Oh God, that's a very tall order. I don't know how many boards get out of bed in the morning for sustainability related issues, unless it's a company that is, again, thinking through a 100-year lens, intergenerationally, thinking about long-term investment, thinking about how sustainability can be a driver for innovation. And I think that is where the rubber meets the road. The companies that I work with that really understand that innovative framework and how renewables can lower prices of energy, how making long term systemic investments will allow them to accelerate against their competitors. Those are the types of people and those are the types of companies that I think are positioned, regardless of what's happening in the political environment, because as you know, that's a 4-year thing. But when you think about a 40-year time horizon, those are the companies that are really positioned to accelerate. And in fact, you see this on a macro level in China. When the U.S. has pulled back from renewable energy, China now is the world's leader in that. And as a result, their energy costs have come down. And one of the most tangible constraints for this race for global AI is, in fact, energy. And as a result of that, you see how the cost of energy is causing us to build nuclear plants. Now, you tell me if you want a nuclear plant in your backyard. And that's the resistance we're seeing from communities all across the US. This concept of climate apartheid, the people that are the most marginalized, the least able to advocate for themselves, the most disenfranchised, and the most vulnerable are the ones who get impacted first. First it was those island nations
Yep.
who was coming to the Paris Climate Accord and
Yep.
UN and complaining that their sea levels are rising, and none of us, seem to care except when we wanted to go there on vacation. That was the start of the impact of climate change. And now you see, oh, wow, energy is expensive. And energy is going to fuel this AI transition that we all
Yep.
are committed to for global dominance, right? Especially nation states. And you see how renewables, which we were saying for the last 2 decades, could have been the unlock for that. But we, went the other way. And now you see institutions, countries, especially with those with the long-term views, such as China, who
Yep.
have their 5-year, 10-year plans, which we got to see firsthand when we visited the Chinese Communist Party as a global leadership fellow in WEF. You see how they think, how they make long-term planning a key to their success, and why they are winning this energy race and able to produce AI at a more cost-effective rate, and they're taking a different bet than the U.S. Right? It's not about speed to market, but it's rather about consistency, sustainability, and longevity.
Absolutely. I mean, I have to admit that I've looked at their BYOD like cars. What is it? DeepSeek, although was a surprise to the market, shouldn't have been. We should have known that they were already working on that. You really helped, companies navigate around this sustainability, this ESG, this responsible AI, and also the energy crisis that's going to come up. So you're talking about those secondary and tertiary, like, evolutions of what that impacts across, stakeholder management. this is clearly have become toxic in some manners, but other people have really taken this as an opportunity, this crisis as an opportunity to go ahead and move it forward, as you just really highlighted. How do you get into these rooms where the people are still playing the quarters versus the decades, really, with what they're thinking about, what they're planning?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to my Accenture consulting training and segment that again. uh, there are some people that are thinking about quarters, and then there's some people that are thinking about decades. Now, the challenge is to figure out how do you get more people incentivized to think in a more long-term view. And a really big lever for that historically has been policy and has been politicians. And theoretically, the politicians represent the will of the people. And that's why you see this new wave of politicians coming into the forefront, who are able to set norms, who are able to inspire, and who are able to challenge the status quo. And I want to make a clear distinction between politics and being civically engaged. And throughout my lifetime, especially working in corporate America, is there's a lot of like laws and procedures and policies around not being politically engaged, especially if you're working at a Swiss organization, if you're working somewhere neutral, if you're working for as a consultancy, you don't want to seem biased, or as an advisory. So there's a lot of red tape around that. But as an American, we all have a duty to be civically engaged. And so the work that I do, whether it's supporting a campaign, whether it's convening a roundtable, whether it's making inroads between the private and public sectors, I view it as my civic duty as an American citizen to improve the state of my community and then eventually improve the state of the world on a more global level. So that's the first part. The second part is, where I was going around this new wave of optimism that we see coming out of New York City, especially, where if you think about New York City in the 1980s, it is the place where artists thrived. It is a place where innovation led the global economic agenda. It came from that chaos. It came from places where people were struggling. And through that struggle was innovative solutions to make their lives better, which were then scaled globally. And now there's multinational companies that benefit from that, and stakeholders and shareholders all over the world that benefit from that. So we know that process works. I think that process has been stifled, and people's hopes and ambitions have been stifled. And so as a result, you see a new wave of leaders who are coming in to inspire people to reclaim that part of their identity, reclaim that part of what is possible. And I think that will have a magnitude of effects, not only on the economy, but a transformational effect on how our society evolves as well.
Absolutely. I think that I don't know if it's ever actually been about politics, or it's really about CEOs that don't really have real power and their own branding within themselves, right? The real conviction to make it in the first place. Because we do see CEOs that have been able to do that, that have been strong leaders, for better or for worse. Like you said, Salesforce, right? Burning off. What is it? You think about Elon Musk or anybody else that has their own brand outside of their company. They've been able to place their bets and hedge them, regardless of what the winds say. I think a lot of leaders jumped on that ESG bandwagon because it was popular, and now they're really kind of jumping off. So, how do you go ahead and convert, as someone who goes ahead and leads leaders, the power behind the ring? What is it to become those CEOs that others follow, that are not just leaders that are performative, that are really just trying to keep their compensation packages safe?
I've had the fortune of working with a lot of CEOs, and let's broaden that to C-suite executives.
Yeah.
Uh, I would say few and far between are not inherently really good people that are very ambitious, that are steadfast in their craft, and have sacrificed a lot to get to those positions, and have really good intentions. It is incredibly hard today to lead a multinational, global, diverse workforce. There's so many constraints. There's so many issues that a C-suite executive has to face. They are not only thinking about the P&Ls that they're managing, they
Mhm.
are thinking about all these external forces that is affecting the mood of their employees, that is affecting
Mhm.
labor conditions, that are affecting sustainability issues along their supply chain, that is affecting geopolitical risk. And they're constantly in this phase of trying to ascertain, how do I weigh off my investment against my risk? How do I bring my people forward and along on the journey? And how do I also like maintain a semblance of who I am and what myself is, and um, have a family life, like have freedom in my life, and not always be in the office. So I think we have to start there, like understanding how difficult it is for to lead an organization, especially in today's day and age. So, if we're starting from that premise, it's easy to say, oh, yeah, they're performative or they're not doing the right thing. I think a lot of decisions sometimes get made because it is a norm, a social norm, and it's a corporate norm, or it's a collective norm, to be operating as part of the West, as part of the EU, as part of the US, etc. And when those norms shift and when those norms move, companies move with it. And I see that is happening at a very mass level. But what you're trying to pull out here is this distinction between a leader that is so convicted to their craft, that is so convicted to their business, that is so. Now, those are the exceptions. I don't know if that is the norm. And I'm not sure if that is the role of business to set norms about society. I think we need to really take a hard look at that and understand what are the failures in other parts of society, who should be held accountable to that should be setting those norms. And that's why I think we need to look at our world through a very private and public lens. In my opinion, I think norms are a product of laws. They get concretized in laws and policies
Mhm.
and should reflect the will of the people. And so as a result, we need to elect policymakers that understand the complexities of living in a digital first, AI native world, and are creating laws and policies that reflect that reality. Unfortunately, we don't have that in place. If we did have that in place, the policies would catch up,
Mhm.
therefore the regulations would catch up, and therefore it's not going to be the job of the CEO of a C-suite executive to be exceptional and figure out how to run a business in a way that satisfies all of these conditions. I think that's an unfair burden that we're putting on executives, and uh, we need to think through that model and evolve that model a little bit more, so we know what the right way is, right? And I think we need to think about competition as well. It is extremely expensive to invest in sustainability measures. It is extremely expensive to pay people, not even just a living wage, but to pay people a wage that they can thrive on. It is extremely expensive to invest in your communities. And if your competitors are not doing the same thing, that's a hit to your bottom line. And when a trader is just looking at your stock price and your performance, they are discounting all of that. They are not looking at future cash flows and giving you a premium for what you've invested in through a sustainability lens. I wish that was the case, but that is not a reality in the financial markets. So if that is not the lever, right, we
Yep.
need to really think about what the right levers are. And I would say it's policy. And we used to live in a world in which policy used to guide how corporations behave. And I think that policy has been really loosened in a way, for two reasons. One, policies sometimes really don't make sense. They're outdated. They need to be updated. And the second is that they create the social scaffolding and the guardrails that protect society. And we need to find the leaders that are brave enough to bring those policies back and ensure that we're all protected from the decisions of one executive and putting the onus on in one person's hand to decide the fate of whether we're going to have internet access, whether we're going to have access to clean water, whether AI is going to be mimicking us, whether we're going to be subject to cyber warfare.
Yep.
And I think having all of this concentration of power in one company, in part of the private sector, and absolving government to play its part is quite dangerous as we look at the evolution of society.
Absolutely. I think this is one of the tallest orders you can possibly do, right? So we have given the privilege to many of these CEOs, to many of these institutions, organizations. I mean, a corporation is now a person, right? And has been codified in our law. And because of that, what is it? We're asking them to give up some of that privilege for the betterment of society. And like you said, they're not going to do it without a law, a risk, or some teeth attached to it to make that happen. And so I think that, we can. And I think back to Adam Smith, right? Why does the baker bake bread? He doesn't just do it for himself. He does it because it benefits society. And in that same circle, in that return, benefits him because he's able to sell it. Which really brings me back to something that I know you wanted to talk about, which was your work with Zorhan and the campaign. You just came off of electing basically New York City's first Muslim and South Asian mayor. Congratulations, a Democratic socialist who beat Andrew Cuomo. What was the experience like for you compared to your work in corporate America? How was it different?
Yeah, so I know Zoran. I met him about 6 years ago because I used to serve on the board of directors for Chaya, which is a community-based organization in Jackson Heights, Queens, that helps immigrants, that helps people pass their citizenship exams, and helps get access to home ownership. In fact,
First
they
time
helped me
home
buy
ownership. That's how I know it.
first time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in fact, they helped both of us actually
Yes.
figure out how to purchase our first homes through all of the different banking programs that exist to help us underwrite that. And so that's how he used to be a community organizer when I was on the board there, and as a result, we have a lot of mutual friends. And so when he was running for public office, and as a result, a state assembly, one of my friends invited me to a house party where, which was effectively a fundraiser for him, and I met this individual through a very different lens at that point. Right, he's not working as a staff of an organization, but rather as a leader of the community. And I was just so impressed
Mm.
by his vision, his commitment, his articulation of what really is the needs of the people, and his reflection of how he needs to operate and how leaders need to operate to ensure the will of the people are met. And it was just so refreshing to see somebody so young, dedicated, and committed to this way of life. And so I was a fan from a very early age, very very early time in that respect. And then a year later, he called me when he was running to be a mayor, and I wanted to help him with the LGBT vote. And then after he won the primaries, I helped uh, do a roundtable with about 60 CEOs to engage with the private sector, to help him engage with the private sector. And this was a collection with some other prominent New Yorkers, and it was a very very fascinating conversation. And one thing about Zoran that I really respect is that he has an ability to talk to people in a way that makes them feel seen, that makes them feel heard, that makes them feel like he's coming to the at the other end of the table with good intentions. And so, as a result of that conversation, it was a privately held conversation. No press was allowed. Chatham House rules, and you saw all of these CEOs lining up and greeting him,
Mm.
similar to, it reminded me when we were in Davos the first time Trump came there, and all of the CEOs lining up in the Congress Center on those stairs as he was walking down, all wanting to meet him,
Yep.
right? But the polar opposite of why and how. And I knew then that he has a real shot of not just winning the race, but also redefining what it means to be a politician, and serving the people and representing their will. So, fast forward, he wins. I helped him raise $500,000 for his transition, and so he can come into office very well funded and come in with a very strong support. And you see 16 days into his administration, today's January 16th, how much he has done, right? On day 8, he got up there with Kathy Hochul and said, we're going to pass childcare,
Yep.
enable childcare, not only across New York City, but across New York State for mothers and their 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds who make less than $100,000 and need childcare so they can participate in the economy and go to work effectively. I mean, amazing. I am so excited to see what he does next, and I'm so confident that he's building the right team around him that will enable him to continue to accelerate.
That's absolutely fantastic. And I can't agree more. We all know that money talks and bullshit walks at the end of the day. And despite the stories that we see in the news, it is clear that corporations stand behind him and what it is that he's trying to do to engage the workforce, like you said, of women who have small children that need the child care, all the way up to, what is the policies that they want around their protection, and their guards, right? So that they can be successful in ESG and creating those values for the shareholders. Um, you know, I also would really like to know what is the difference between community engagement and political engagement, because those seem like fundamentally different, muscle memory. Can you go ahead and dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, I was meeting with the CEO right before the holidays, and he said to me, you seem to have a lot of community engagement and political engagement in your work, and we don't want to come off as biased, and we don't want to come off as partial in any way.
Yep.
And I said to him, I have values and the work that I do reflect those values. And he said, we all have values. I was like, you're absolutely right about that. And, but the values could drive you to do very different things, right?
Yes.
I think everyone in this world has values, but you really have to uncode what those values are and how that drives the work that you do. I will say that community engagement is maybe the foundational work that we need to think about when we think about how we want to show up in life. It is your neighbor, it is the people in your town community board, or it is the parents of the kids that you go to school with, like your individual community that ensures that you have a good life, you have a great neighborhood, the trash gets picked up, and you have a good quality of life for you and the people that you love most. And I think that base allows you to really then think about what's working, what can be extrapolated into a national level, what can be replicated on a global level. And if we start thinking through that, then we understand, well, what is the role of the corporation to help accelerate this? What is the role of the public sector to help accelerate this? And what is my role as an individual as I touch both the private and public sectors, whether I show up at a corporation to work, whether I serve on a board, whether I run for office, or help others in government advise them on what policies should be instituted. You think about the role that you can play, because we're all very multidisciplinary and we all have a infinite amount of choices of how we want to expend our energy, and we get to choose how we want to show up in this life. And as a result, you know you can go to work and sit at your desk and put your head down and type away and ignore everything that's happening around you, or you can choose to operate very differently. I choose to operate in a way that I can use my leverage, my network, and my connections, and my intellect, and my passion for improving not only my community, but improving how the world is moving forward and what policies are guiding that.
I can't agree more. I think, for myself personally, what is it? I feel like no matter what side of the divide you're on, I think we're all going towards the same goal, which is we want a better life, community, and society, as well as the global world, this one, ball of dirt that we're floating around the sun in, to be better tomorrow than it is today. It's the how we go about it that is I think, drastically divergent, right? But if you want change, you have to be the change you want to see in the world. So people need to be more activated and more engaged in what they're doing and how they're going about it, whether it's through their community or through a larger lens. Really thinking about that, I think you touched a little bit on both corporate and politics, and how those, intertwine and work together. Um, Through your time, what are some of the times where you've been advising a company and you've seen the red flags and you're like, this isn't going to work? They're not going to do it.
Yeah, I think that happens way too often than it should.
Yeah.
Um, I will give you an example of something that's very relevant right now that's happening in this transition towards AI. I've worked for an organization that was really a leader in this and worked with all of the tech giants to adopt and bring their people forward. And I saw firsthand how much investment it takes in order to make this transition across a global workforce where hundreds of thousands of people work. And the investment is around change management,
Mm.
and the investment is around communication. The investment is around new models of working.
Yep.
The investment is around upskilling your employees. The investment is in training and development, and so on and so forth. But then there's another part of this, which is around human behavior.
Yes.
And the largest challenge around human behavior is, how do I, as an employee, get affected by this transformation? Do I see my role in this transformation as a catalyst, or do I see myself as an observer of this and being impacted in a way that is going to negatively impact me? If I fall into the bucket where I think that this transformation is going to negatively impact me, what is my incentive to participate in my upskilling? What is my incentive to participate in a way that I think participation will erode my job and my ability to make money and ensure that the company can move on without me?
Yep.
That central fear has driven transformations, or has caused so many failures in transformations throughout corporate America. And I've worked also with very heritage companies that are looking to not only improve their business model, but also digitize in a way that they're competitive in the 21st century. And that's the number one block. It's not about how many dollars they're investing in AI infrastructure and cloud and data, but it's about the willingness of their employees to actually embrace that. And that's where all the friction happens. And I think the job of the CHRO, the job of impact officers, the job of people that are very close to the humans and their emotions and understanding what unlocks them and what inspires them, needs to be integrated in that investment discipline that says we're going to invest several $1 million in upgrading our technology infrastructure, but how much money are we going to actually invest in our people to ensure they embrace the technology and adopt it and then move the organization forward? That piece fails to get the right amount of investment over and over again, and you see all these companies really struggling to adopt and move up the AI value chain.
This show is really about money, power, influence, failure, and resilience. And my next question is really about what kills deals quietly. Whether it's ego, whether it's fear, or misaligned incentives. And I think you really kind of touched on all of those bases as to how these things die on the vine, right? Whether it's from the top down or from the bottom up, both of those perspectives are really aligned around those concepts around misaligned incentives, fear, ego, and not being participant in the process. And you've also really kind of touched on a couple of different things. So you've done things like board seats, advisory roles, speaking gigs. You've really operated in a world where relationships and access matter more than anything else. So pivoting a little bit, how did you build that kind of network?
Yeah. When you were talking about deals, I really pride myself on being able to take all the mumbo jumbo that I talk about and translate it into money, right? So I'm very good at monetizing concepts and ideas, inspiring people, and building coalitions to make that happen, whether it be through a private public lens or whether it be through a purely private play. So there's two deals that I'm really proud of. One is a $9 million partnership that I constructed between Harry Winston, the jeweler, and AMFAR, which is the Foundation for AIDS Research.
Yeah.
And the second was a $3 million partnership with Fortinet, which is a cybersecurity company, and the World Economic Forum to underwrite the first cybersecurity center of the world, which was bringing in all of these state actors that would never come together, like India, Russia, China, and the U.S., to really think about non-state actors that play an outsized role in cyber warfare that are not commissioned. In both of those very, very diverse deals, I think my approach has always been solutions oriented, innovation oriented. What can we solve together? How can we operate better when we come together? So it's not about embracing differences, but it's really about like what is a commonality? Like what is the common ground,
Yep.
right? And so for the AMFAR example, it was around finding a cure for AIDS, right? It was a moonshot goal this is in 2012 when we were saying, hey, you know, where do we have allies that also want to help find a cure for AIDS by the year 2020? And we realized that there is this intersection between the donors of AMFAR
Yep.
that that are very wealthy and that have a 20 or 30-year view in their investment, a lot of patient capital, and then the consumer base of Harry Winston that is also very wealthy and also view the long-term investment. And the reason why that's important because scientific research takes a very long time to unfold. And now, fast forward, it's been more than decade and a half since that work, and you saw all the investment that was made for AIDS research has unlocked cancer discoveries, has unlocked biohackers, has unlocked all this amazing secondary and tertiary impacts of that research that we never could have even imagined, right? And it was because we had that long-term view and we made that long-term investment. And that's my wish for how we want to operate in the sustainability space as well, right? Because you have no idea when you invest in innovation what the outcomes will be. And oftentimes, innovations are accidents. And as a result, you have these huge discoveries, these huge unlocks that you never could have predicted. That's the benefit of having a long term view in how we operate. And then the second part of your question is, well, how do you actually pull such disparate forces
Yep.
together? And I think, you know, going with the cybersecurity example, you have to figure out a way like what is the single bottom line, or actually, what is the single denominator that each of these actors have in common? And then if we were to invest in that, how can they each of them benefit, right? And that requires trust, that requires consensus, and that requires an ability to get people around the table who normally would not and have them agree on something, which is the convening power, which I think WEF is unparalleled at. And that is all a function of relationships. So it is about having relationships in which people trust you to show up at the table and then trust you enough to be vulnerable enough to actually come together and say, what are the incentives that drive me? Where's there intersection between that incentive again with my competitor or with my adversary? And then how do we leverage that to actually bring something together that benefits all of us? Now, if a couple of more people who are leading the world today was able to operate like that, I think we could solve so many more problems.
Absolutely. Um, it made me think of something when I was a kid. I was like, if we got everybody high and withheld the Cheetos from them, that we could solve a lot of the world problems. But that was a 20-year-old me. What is it? Very different in the space now. Although I still wonder if it might work. But the level where we're playing at, right, is really around elite spaces, right? And once you're in the door, those other doors open, right? So once you get in and you've become a trusted advisor, additional doors to other people that are in that ecosphere really do open. But the hard part, especially for people, even people that are already in the room, right, that don't have traditional access, whether it be a female or a person of color, that really never really felt comfortable What is your advice to those and others that are trying to get their foot in the door and that are already in the room to go ahead and bring that credibility?
Let's go back to your premise. In 2026, it's very painful for me to say or to acknowledge that females and people of color don't have access, because in pockets of our society they do. I think you and I have a tremendous amount of access and privilege that we enjoy. What we need to be mindful of is, don't pull the ladder up behind you after you got in the room, right?
Yeah.
Make sure that there's a path for others to follow, right? That's the responsibility that we have once we ascertain a certain level of privilege and certain level of access. I think that's very important to remember, because I think it's too naive to say all females and people of color don't have access. I think we live in a very different world, a global world in which a lot of us do. And we need to really be serious about what are we going to do with that and what is our responsibility in that line. So what was the second part of your question? I was just
I was
very.
talking about those of us who have made it into those spaces where we've never really kind of completely felt comfortable. How do we go ahead and build out that network so that we can go ahead and continue to go ahead and build on our credibility and be the change makers that we want to be in this world?
Yeah, Tiffany, I would really flip that question upside down, because in 2026 we see an unprecedented level of disruption, and I have talking to many leaders who don't know what the playbook is going to be for the next 20 years, because there is none. And so there's no reason to feel uncomfortable or unsure, to have an idea, to take a leap of faith, to make an investment, because we are making up the playbook as we go along. And if more people knew how unsure people that are leading organizations and countries and institutions felt that way, they would have more confidence to experiment and try and to put themselves out there and do new things, because there is no predictability anymore. And as a result, you can use that to your advantage, and I encourage your listeners to do so.
All right, one final question, and I want you to be completely honest. If you had one thing to say to all of our listeners that you haven't been able to say behind closed doors or in boardrooms, what would it be?
My take around, I don't know who exactly is going to be finding this podcast, but I also don't think it matters. I think we live in an age today where self integrity and self responsibility are extremely paramount. It decides how you're going to show up at work. It decides how you're going to show up in the world and in your local communities. And I think it's that from that integrity, one must figure out how they want to lead and how they want to show up and who they want to be. And that goes into our upbringings, our religions, our faiths. I think the world has plenty of information and guidance around how one integrates with themselves and their values, right? The thing is that in a world that we're faced with a tremendous amount of noise, we're faced with a tremendous amount of distractions. How do you retain that? How do you self-regulate in a way that you can allow yourself, despite of the disruptions and the misinformation and all the different things that are coming at you, that you have the discipline to be able to discern what's important and then act on what's important. And I think that discipline, that self-regulation, that discernment is what is necessary to be an effective leader, to be an effective parent, to be an effective member of our community.
I can't agree more. That's kind of the brutal honesty that we need, which is, again, to be the change that you want to be in the world. Show up, do it messy, do it unprepared, just go and be that action. Shameek, thank you so much for being on Confluently.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And I just want to let you know that if more of these conversations without the sanitized corporate speak, you know where to find me. This is Confluently. It's been an absolute pleasure. Until the next time, I'll see you there.